Hi, I'm Pam Fox, and we're streaming live on YouTube. Welcome back to my Bible study in the book of Genesis. This week we're in chapter 33. And so, just as a little bit of a review, um, we've been going through this story of the origins of God's chosen people, Israel. And it began there when God started this covenant with Abraham. And he continued. We've been going through the book of Genesis, and we see how God reestablishes and continues this covenant throughout the children of Abraham, or the descendants of Abraham. So he began the covenant with Abraham, saying, I am your God, you'll be my people, a great nation will come out of you, and a bunch of other stuff. But that was kind of the big deal, that through Abraham would come a nation, God's chosen people, and would eventually come a blessing that would bless all families of the world. And of course, we know that to be fulfilled in the coming of Jesus Christ. It still has a further fulfillment to be taken place in the return of Christ and setting up his millennial kingdom. But the blessing was for all people. It wasn't just for God's select, it was for all people. And he continued this, reaffirmed this covenant through his son Isaac and through his son Jacob, which is where we're at today. And this covenant, I know I keep talking about it, but it's important to really kind of get a grasp on what this covenant meant and what it still means today, which is, and what the blessing meant and what it still means today. So the blessing, the blessing would come to bless all families of the earth. Again, that was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. He came, he lived, he died, and he was resurrected. And he did all of that for a reason. And it was to be able to bless all people through his life, through his death, through his resurrection. And the whole point of that was that he redeemed all people. And that's kind of an interesting word. And I just want to take a moment to kind of talk about that, because it really is the foundation of the Christian doctrine, this idea that we've been redeemed. And a lot of us, when we think of the word redeemed, we think of like you have to redeem yourself due to something bad you did, or a trait in yourself that's not good or whatever. But the idea that we've been redeemed has a totally different meaning, and it's this idea of being purchased. And so back when slavery was a common thing, to set a slave free, they had to be either set free by their owner, which was pretty rare. I mean, I'm not talking about within the Jewish custom, I'm talking about generally in the world. It was pretty rare to just set a slave free for no reason. Or the slave could be redeemed, which would mean that the owner would set a ransom, what they thought that slave was worth, what that slave's value was in terms of, how much work they do around the household or whatever. They would set a ransom or a price on that person. And if someone wanted to come along and pay that ransom, then that slave could be set free. That was perfectly legal within the system of the time. So this idea of being redeemed or being purchased in order to be set free. And of course, that didn't happen that often either, because it would be expensive to pay a slave owner what this human was worth to him, which would have been a lifetime of labor. So when Jesus came along and he died on the cross, he shed his blood, and that the redemption there is, what it really means is that all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. All of us deserve punishment for sinning against God, our Creator. And that punishment that we earn, it's called wages, and it's death. The punishment is death. And so Jesus comes along and he dies on the cross and he pours out his redeeming blood. And if that blood is on us, then God looks at us and he says, you've been redeemed. You've been purchased. Someone paid the price in your stead. And so that is the blessing for the whole world, for all the families of the world. That Jesus came, he lived, he died, he was resurrected. He shed out his blood. He shed his blood for our redemption, for our purchase. And so we've been set free. And I just brought up a couple, and there's a lot of verses in the Bible you can really go crazy learning about this concept. Let's just look at a couple of them. Hebrews 9:11 says, So Christ has now become the high priest over all the good things that have come. He has entered that greater, more perfect tabernacle in heaven, which was not made by human hands and is not part of this created world. With his own blood, not the blood of goats and calves, he entered the most holy place once for all time and secured our redemption forever. So remember, under the old system before Jesus came along, the high priest had to go into the Holy of Holies, into the tabernacle on the Day of Atonement. You know, the animals had to be killed, the blood had to be poured, it had to be sprinkled. And this was the ceremony that was the way to redeem people of their sins, but it had to be repeated. It had to be done every year on the Day of Atonement for the sins of the people. And that was the people who were Jews. Jesus died on the cross for all people. His blood can cover all people, all sins. He died once and for all, and he purchased all of us. And all we have to do is accept that and believe in him, and receive that gift of eternal salvation, which means we get to live forever with Jesus, with God, in that place that he's going to prepare for us, the place where there's no more death, no more sin, no more disease, no more war, no more lies, no more cheating, no more stealing. All of that will not be in that nirvana, that place that we all aspire to, that paradise. So God has made a way, and it was through his son Jesus. Let's just read one more really quick. Romans 3:23 says, "For everyone has sinned, we all fall short of God's glorious standard, yet God freely and graciously declares that we are righteous. He did this through Christ Jesus when he freed us from the penalty for our sins. For God presented Jesus as the sacrifice for sin. People are made right with God when they believe that Jesus sacrificed his life, shedding his blood." Okay, I'm not sure what version that is. It's not the King James, but I think you get the picture. And then, so that's good. So we'll go ahead and move on from that and get in today's chapter. But just as by way of review, we are now focusing on Jacob. Jacob went, he lived with his father-in-law, Laban, who I keep calling his cousin, and I keep saying that because their grandfathers were brothers. But Laban was Jacob's mother's brother, which also makes him his uncle. I think, to be more technical, Laban is Jacob's uncle. He lived with his uncle for 20 years. He left his hometown because his mom said, "You got to get out of town. Your twin brother wants to kill you for stealing the birthright, for tricking Esau into taking the birthright and the blessing." So he leaves and he goes and stays with Laban for 20 years. And that's where we were last week. We saw he was heading home. He had taken his family. He was on his way home. And then he took his wives and his 11 sons and he removed them from the camp, right? Because he knew Esau was coming and he was afraid he was coming to slaughter his whole household. So he removed his wives and his children. He took them even further away from the camp after he'd already sent people of his household ahead to meet Esau with a very generous gift. And so in the night, he removes his wives and his children. Maybe he thought that there was going to be this ambush in the night. It doesn't really say, but he took them across the river, or he sent them across the river. And also something I didn't mention last week, but his children at this point, these 11 sons, all would have been under the age of 13. They would have been kids. His youngest was Joseph at the time, and he would have been 2, maybe 3, somewhere in there, 1, 2, or 3 years old, somewhere in there. That's all we know at this point in the story, based on just the different clues that were given. But he took his wives and his children and he sent them across the river to a secluded place. And then as he headed back to his camp, we saw that he encountered God. So that was last week, where Jacob wrestled with God, and we won't go through that again, but my interpretation of that is that Jacob wrestled until the breaking of the next morning of day, and it's really a picture of wrestling with God instead of submitting to God. And you can interpret this wrestling with God in a number of different ways. And I don't think any of them are wrong. I think it doesn't have to be either or, it can be all of the above. But this is just the way I see it. We saw him wrestling with Jacob. We saw him giving Jacob a handicap after a period of time, allowing him to feel additional pain. And to me, it reminds me of our suffering in life, right? When we sometimes we suspect God wants us to do this, and we struggle against it. We say, I don't want to do that. I'm not gonna do that. And that's kind of what we saw with God wrestling with Jacob. And then he finally tells Jacob, let me go, as if to say, and some people will interpret this as Jacob was clinging to God, right? Again, which that could be the case. But because he gave Jacob that handicap, he touched his thigh and he gave him that handicap, so that it made it painful while they were wrestling. It made it even harder for him to wrestle with this man who was, they were equal. God, in the form that he presented himself as this man wrestling with Jacob, they were equal. And so they were kind of in a gridlock all night long. I talked last week about, being like in an arm wrestle where you're just kind of in that gridlock and you're just waiting for someone to give in. And so really the picture I see here, because again, in the context, it says that he prevailed when he gave in. He prevailed when he humbled himself. He prevailed when he said uncle. That was when God considered him prevailing. And we talked quite a lot about that last week. So if you missed it, make sure you go back and see that, because I think there's a lot of application in that story to my life and to your life, and this idea that we don't have to do it all. We don't have to be in charge of everything and take control of everything and do it all. Yes, God wants us to live a certain way, and he wants us to strive, and he wants us to love him, and he wants us to love people. But he also wants us to enter into his rest. And he wants us to be faithful and allow him to call the shots. Okay? So that was last week, and we left off at the very end there. Let's just look at it really quick as we enter into chapter 32, or chapter 33. He wrestled with this man, and then he let him go, and the man blessed him and said, your name is no longer Jacob, it's Israel. And he asked the guy, well, what's your name? And he didn't answer him. And then he names that place where he wrestled with this man. He names it Penuel, which means the face of God. For I have seen the face of God, he said, and my life is preserved. And we know when we study the Bible that no one has seen the face of God, because it tells us here. I brought this verse up. Let me just show you. In the New International Version, in John 1:18 says, no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son. Only Jesus has seen God. He says, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. And then in Exodus 33:20 it says, this is God speaking. He says, you cannot see my face, for no one can see me and live. God said that. You cannot, for no one can see me and live. I apologize for the poor streaming. The connectivity is poor right now. Darn it. So we'll see these accounts throughout the Bible where people claim they see God face to face. This is one of them where Jacob is seeing God face to face. And so really when you look at those different accounts, it's God revealing himself in different forms, and that's what the people see. But God doesn't reveal his true face to the people, because if he did, again, here he said himself, you cannot see my face, for no one can see me and live. You would die in the presence of God if you saw his true identity, because there's so much power there. And so he reveals himself in these different forms, like the burning bush or the column of smoke or the column of fire, or here this man that wrestled with Jacob. Or remember his grandfather Abraham was visited by the Lord and two men, and they sat around and hung out. One of them was God. Or Adam and Eve, they walked in the cool of the day with God. But it wasn't the raw God. It was an expression of God. It was who God chose to express himself as, so that the people wouldn't die in his powerful presence. Okay. So let's get into chapter 33. We left off, Jacob was wrestling with this man, the sun rose, and now he's got to go about his business because Esau is on his way. Okay, so, and Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men. And he divided the children into Leah and into Rachel and into the two handmaids. And he put the handmaids and their children foremost, and Leah and her children after, and Rachel and Joseph hindermost. So remember, in last week's chapter, we saw him send ahead a group of people with the livestock, the gift for Esau. And he divided that group up so that as Esau approached these different groups, he'd be like, who are you? What you doing? Who do these cattle belong to? And they were instructed to say, my Lord, Jacob is behind us, your humble servant. This gift is for you. So every time Rachel or Esau approach another group, it would be the same thing. My Lord, our humble, your humble servant Jacob is behind us. This is a gift for you. And now Jacob sees him coming in the distance, and he divides up the camp that he's there with Leah and Rachel and the handmaids and their 11 sons and Dinah, their daughter, and he divides them up. And he sends the handmaids and their children in the front of the group, and then Leah and her children, and then Rachel, and we'll see that Jacob is going to be in the very front, but his wives and his children are behind him, and they're in different groups. Again, the idea being that if he can't save all of his family, maybe he could save some of them. We don't see God telling him to do this. This is him trying to take control of the situation, which is interesting to me because you might look at this as a person studying the Bible and say, geez, Jacob, why don't you get it? Like, God wants you to, submit to him and let him rule and reign over your life. And you'll be so much better off. But I mean, how many of us actually do the same? We try to, but we're not that good at it, right? I was thinking about this YouTube channel and how when I first started it, I kept thinking to myself, I should do a Bible study on my YouTube channel. I had already had a YouTube channel, and it was a nutrition and healing YouTube channel. That was my content. And now I'm thinking to myself, I want to do a Bible study on my YouTube channel. I had never led a Bible study before. I didn't feel like I really knew my Bible that well. And I kept having this idea. You should lead a Bible study on your YouTube channel. And so I just kept saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. I mean, for months, I would get the idea and think, you should do that. And I'd be like, no, I'm not going to do that. And then I just woke up one day, it was early in January, and I just got up and I did it. It was just like, I'm going to do this. Because this nagging, it just kept coming and coming and coming. And that was in January of 2020. So I've been doing this now for a couple of years, pretty consistently and faithfully. And it's been a huge blessing in my life. Huge blessing in my life. I hope it's been a blessing to someone else. So anyway, here comes Jacob. He's still trying to control this whole situation because he's sure his twin brother is out to get him. So he divides up the last remaining people in his camp into these 4 groups, himself in the front, then the handmaids and their children, then Leah and her children, and then finally Rachel, the one that he loves, and her son, their son Joseph, who would have been a little toddler at that time. Okay, so here we go. Verse 3. And he passed over before them, so Jacob was in the front, and he bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. And Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. So here we have a happy ending to the story, which isn't always the case, of course, in the Bible. We have some really tragic endings to stories, but here we have a happy ending to the story, in a sense where Jacob was sure that Esau was coming to murder him and his entire family, and instead he hugs him and kisses him and they cry together. And it doesn't tell us that Esau greets him this way because of all these gifts, or if that was his intention from the start, was to reunite with his brother, his twin brother. Maybe he missed his brother. Maybe he loved his brother. Maybe he felt bad about wanting to kill his brother. Maybe after he cooled down a little bit, he realized, well, he did trick me out of the birthright and the blessing, but I never cared about the birthright. That's a fact. Like, I despised the birthright. So yeah, he tricked me out of it, but I really didn't want it to begin with. If you remember, he went out hunting, and when he came back, he said he was starving, and Jacob had this pot of soup cooking, and Jacob said, I'll give you a bowl of soup for the birthright, and Esau was like, okay. I mean, he didn't even, I mean, he could have gotten food anywhere else, but he wanted that soup because he was hungry in the moment, and it smelled good, and he probably had it before, and he knew it was good, and so he traded his birthright for a bowl of soup. He didn't care about the birthright, but Jacob did. He understood the importance of it. So we don't know if Esau, if he was softened by what Jacob did, sending all these people ahead, my Lord, your humble servant's behind us, here's a gift, or if he intended to reconcile joyously with his twin. We don't know, it doesn't say. But that's what happens. Nevertheless, they reconcile joyously. So let's go on. In verse 5, it says, so they're hugging and kissing and crying. It says, and he lifted up his eyes and saw the women and the children and said, who are those with thee? And he said, Jacob answers, the children which God hath graciously given thy servant. So Jacob continues with this humble stature. I am your servant, you're my Lord. Even though Esau says we're cool, he continues with this stature of servitude and humility. Verse 6, and the handmaidens came near, they and their children, and they bowed themselves. And Leah also with her children came near and bowed themselves. And after came Joseph near and Rachel, and they bowed themselves. So his whole family now, whether he has instructed them ahead of time or they just saw him modeling this stature of humility where he bowed himself as he was approaching Esau. And this wasn't just like a little thing like that. It would have been falling down flat on the ground more than likely, just like prostrate on the dirt, humbling himself. Likely that's what it would have been. I know it doesn't say that, but we see that elsewhere in the custom of the Jewish people. When they would bow, it wasn't just a dropping on one knee or like nodding their head. They would lay flat on the ground, just like in the dirt. That's how they bowed. And so he would stop and he would bow, and then he would get up and go a little further towards Esau. He did that 7 times. I can just imagine Esau sitting up on his horse or his camel or whatever, just like, what is he doing? And then all his wives and his children come and they do the same thing. And again, it wouldn't have been just like it would have been like on the ground, his whole family bowed before Esau, likely. Verse 8, and he said, what meanest thou by all this drove which I met? And he said, Jacob said, these are to find grace in the sight of my Lord. So Esau's asking, like, why in the world did you send this drove of animals ahead? Even though he should have known why, because all the servants were instructed to say, my Lord, thy servant Jacob is behind us. This is a gift from him. But he's kind of like, to me, I feel like he's saying, you didn't have to do that. What are you thinking? You didn't have to go to all that. He says, what meanest thou by all this drove which I met? And he said, these are to find grace in the sight of my Lord. So we see this again where Jacob is saying, that he's seeking grace in the sight of his Lord. And you have to understand that word grace means unmerited favor. It means I'm guilty of the crime that I committed against you, but I'm asking for your mercy even though I don't deserve it because I am guilty. Jacob admits that he tricked his brother out of the birthright and the blessing. It was sneaky. Both times the birthright, Jacob just readily and hastily agreed to that deal. So I don't consider that as sneaky as the blessing, where he and his mom Rebecca, like they put together this whole grand scheme that would have taken time to, put together and to execute. And it was they deceived their father Isaac, and they deceived Esau. Or they tricked him. They stole the birthright basically from him. He was out hunting, and they just, while he was gone, they tricked, their blind dad into thinking that Jacob was Esau. So they went to great lengths to really, fraudulently deceive Isaac and steal something from Esau, which is not good, So he's admitting his guilt here. He's bowing down before his brother, and he's asking for grace. He's asking for that unmerited favor or mercy from his brother. So Esau asks him, like, what the heck are you thinking? Why did you go to all this trouble? And he's saying, because he seeks, I seek your grace. He tells his brother, I'm seeking your grace. That's why. And verse 9 is, and Esau said, I have enough, my brother. Keep that thou hast unto thyself. So he doesn't want the gift. He says, I have plenty. And Jacob said, nay, I pray thee, if now I have found grace in thy sight, then receive my presents at my hand. Receive my presents at my present at my hand. For therefore I have seen thy face, as though I had seen the face of God, and thou was pleased with me. So there's a couple of things happening here. One, Esau saying, I don't want your gift, you keep it. And Jacob is saying, now that I've found grace in your sight, he feels that he's received grace or forgiveness from his brother. And now that he has, he wants him to take this gift kind of like as a symbol that Jacob has admitted his guilt, Esau has forgiven him, and they're good now. They've reconciled. And he wants this gift to be a symbol of that. And then he goes on to say, for therefore I have seen thy face as though I have seen the face of God. He's talking about this wrestling match he had just the night before. He's saying that I'm here in front of you face to face, and it's the same as I was with God face to face. He's saying they're synonymous, which tells us that, because some people want to say that in the night he had a vision of this wrestling with God, which makes no sense because he limped off in the morning. He walked off with a limp. So again, Jacob thinks he saw God face to face. And I'm not saying he didn't wrestle with God. I take him for his word. I'm not going to disregard what he says, but had he seen God in his raw form, he would have died. So we know that God was expressing himself in the form of a man that Jacob could be in the presence of without dying. All right. I know sometimes I get off on these little tangents, but if it's mentioned in the Bible, in my opinion, it's important, and we should consider it and take a look at it and ponder it. Okay, so verse 11, he says, take, I pray thee, please take it. Take, I pray thee, my blessing that is brought to thee, because God hath dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough. And he urged him, and he took it. So he really persuades Esau to take this gift. He's saying, God has blessed me. I have plenty. Trust me, I'm not going to miss this. I want you to have it. I want you to have it. And it wasn't really about, the wealth that he would lose or the wealth that Esau would gain. Again, it was this symbol of their reconciliation and this idea that Jacob was guilty, but Esau found grace. He forgave guilty. He forgave Jacob, and now they could be brothers again, which is really a cool thing, I think. The idea of anytime there's a wedge or a drift among friends or family, and they can somehow overcome that and reconcile, it's a wonderful, amazing, beautiful thing. And he took it, verse 12, and he said, let us take our journey, and let us go, and I will go before thee. This is Esau talking. He says, all right, let's go, I'll lead the way. And Jacob answers, he says, and he said unto him, my Lord knoweth, still with this posture of humility, he calls him my Lord knoweth that the children are tender. His kids are young. They're all under the age of 13. And the flocks and herds with young are with me. So the flocks and herds have their babies too. And if men should overdrive them one day, all the flock will die. Let my Lord, I pray thee. So he says, please, my Lord, pass over before his servant. I will lead on softly, according as the cattle that goeth before me, and the children be able to endure until I come unto my Lord, unto Seir. And Esau said, let me now leave with thee some of the folk that are with me. So Jacob wants Esau to go ahead and go. He doesn't want to go at the pace that Esau is going to go. Esau is a strong man with a 400-man army, more strong man. Jacob is a father with wives and little kids and flocks and all their young. He wants to go at his own pace. So he's saying, please, we need to go at our own pace. We this our my animals could die if we go at the pace of your men. And Esau says, well, let me leave some of my men with you to help you, basically. And Jacob answers, what needeth it? Let me find grace in the sight of my Lord. In other words, there's no need. I don't need your men. It's okay. So we really kind of see this back and forth between two men. Here's a gift. Please take it. No, no, no. You keep it. No, no, no. I want you to have it. No, no, no. I'm good. I don't need it. No, I want you to have it. And then they come to an agreement. And now they're talking about the pace at which we're going to go, who's going to lead, and they're kind of going back and forth. And he asks again, let me find grace in the sight of my Lord. He's asking Esau to give him his way, and he wants to go at his own pace. So it says Esau returned that day on his way into Seir. And Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built him a house, and made booths for his cattle. Therefore the name of the place is called Succoth. And Jacob came to Shalem, a city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan. And when he came from Paddan Aram, that's where he lived there with his father-in-law Laban, and pitched his tent before the city. So let's understand what's happening here. Jacob arrives at his homeland and he builds a house there in Succoth. And he builds a barn, and that's where his family lives. Then he travels into Shalem, he travels to Shalem, which is a person, in the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan. Remember, this is all modern day Israel. This is the land we're talking about. And Shalem, many people agree that that's also synonymous with Salem. Shalem, Salem. Remember the high priest King Melchizedek, the one who encountered Abraham. I don't know if you remember that. And then we'll see later in the book of Hebrews that there is coming, the prophetic coming of the millennial reign, which will be Jesus as King of Kings after the order of King Melchizedek, which is an order of a life where there's no more animal sacrifices, there's spiritual sacrifices, there's worship, there's praise, really painting this picture of a different type of temple or tabernacle than that of the original tabernacle, or the tabernacle of Moses, and then the temple of King David. Two very different pictures of this order of Melchizedek, a different type of tabernacle, again, where there will be spiritual sacrifices of worship and of praise and of thanksgiving. That's to come. That's in the future. We have some of that now as human beings living with the Spirit of God in us. We can offer up spiritual sacrifices, and we no longer have the old system of the animal sacrifices. So we've entered into that already, but it hasn't been completely fulfilled, I believe, as it will be in the end times. So here we see Jacob coming into Shalem or Salem or Jerusalem, and he pitches his tent before the city. This is different than Succoth, where he built his house. So he pitches his tent before the city of Canaan, or Shalem. You have to understand that modern day Israel is about similar in size to the state of New Jersey, which is one of the smaller states in the U.S. It takes about a couple of hours to drive across the country of Israel, and it takes about 9 or 10 hours to drive from north to south. So it's a long country, but it's narrow. So about 2 hours across and about 9 or 10 hours in length. So it's a small country, but that's not to say, I mean, it's bigger than the town I live in. It's bigger than Portland. It's bigger than LA, much bigger. So there's a lot of land there. There's a lot of areas, a lot of places, a lot of towns there in the biblical Israel, which hasn't become Israel yet at this point, but it's about to. So Jacob says he pitches his tent before the city, and he buys a parcel. It says, and he bought a parcel of a field where he had spread his tent. So there where he pitched his tent, he buys that land. It says he bought a parcel of a field where he had spread his tent at the hand of the children of Hamor. So he's just saying who he bought it from, the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. And he erected there an altar, and he called it El Elohi Israel. So here you could say we have an official or unofficial kind of a birth of Israel in terms of geographically speaking. Um, he already has 11 of the 12 sons at this point, so the birth of Israel has already begun. But here, geographically speaking, we have the birth of the nation of Israel there in the land that God promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's it. That is chapter 33. The story continues with Jacob next week. Weeks actually. And again, the focus is going to shift in about, I think, 3 chapters. Four chapters. In verse 37, it's going to shift. The focus is going to shift to Joseph. And the rest of Genesis is going to be primarily about Joseph. So that's it, everyone. Thanks for being here. I pray you have a wonderful, blessed day. I pray God's blessing on you. I continue to pray that God is calling you, that God is drawing you near to Him, that He's increasing your faith, that He's intervening in your life and keeping you from evil and providing for all your needs, and that He's strengthening you. And I pray that He give you a real hunger and a thirst for the Word of God, for going deeper in the Word of God, reading it, yes, but really studying it, pondering it, mulling it over, going to and fro through the Word. I know I've talked about this before, but a couple of great resources that I love. One is the eSword, which I have on my desktop, but I have probably 3 Bible apps on my Bible. You can download them onto your phone for free. And if you get one with a word search function in it, I find that incredibly, that has opened up and then changed the entire way I study and understand the Bible. Because when you see a certain word or a phrase, and you think, I wonder where else that's used in the Bible to get a more fullness of what they're talking about. And then you go back and you put that in the search function and it brings up all the times that and you read through those. You really start to get a better understanding. And that's not to say that word is going to be used the same in every single context. It's not. But oftentimes you'll find the first use of that word in the Bible, and sometimes a certain phrase or a word is only used once in the entire Bible. For example, this L-E-L, what is it? I closed it out. Elohim Israel. Elohim Israel. That in the Bible spelled that exact same way, in that the way it's spelled there in this chapter we just studied, that's the only time in the whole Bible it's there. So all that to say, I really encourage you, if you haven't, to make sure you have a Bible app on your phone with a search function, and that you're looking up these words and looking up their definitions. If you get a Bible app with the Strong's puts out a Bible app that has the whole Strong's concordance there on your phone. Well, not on your phone, but in the app, so that you can not only look up where the word is in the Bible, but you can look up, the Hebrew meaning, the Greek meaning, and I find that to be really helpful as well. All right, so that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and hopefully we'll see you here next week.